And the stunning proposal that was made by the U.S. delegate at the Washington Naval Conference was that the United States offered to stop producing any new ships, scrap the ships that had already been built, and actually cut back on quite a few of its own ships, in other words, to destroy them. Now, this is an interesting offer because the United States would be offering to basically disarm itself, and it must have been a great surprise to the delegates from the other nations. But the United States actually sent in a second or another caveat to this, which was that it would do so as long as the other nations involved in the conference would do the same, and in fact, that when the cutting of ships or the destruction of ships was over, that the ones that remained would remain in the ratio that you see here under bullet point number 2, and that is that for every 5 war vessels that the United States had, the British would get 5 war vessels, the Japanese 3.5, the French 1.75, and the Italians 1.75. And we're talking about capital ships, which usually means battleships. And this also included banning any guns on battleships that were over 16 inches in diameter. And there were no limitations on aircraft carriers. People didn't really understand the importance of these. Now, what's interesting here is that the other nations then, of course, as you probably would suspect, were a bit taken aback by this idea of this ratio. One of the questions you could ask is, why is the ratio set up the way that it is? The argument that the U.S. delegates made was that the United States and the British had holdings in 2 separate oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic, so they needed bigger navies. The Japanese were in the Pacific, which is very, very large. The French, for the most part, were in the Mediterranean with a little bit in Asia, and the Italians were definitely in the Mediterranean. So the idea was everybody would have what they needed, and yet nobody would have anything more than they needed, so that it wouldn't by accident create some sort of difficulty. Now, there's no question that you could see the Japanese or the French or the Italians are becoming very angry about this. But the U.S. then added another statement to their proposal, and it was, if you decide not to follow our lead or do what we've asked here, then the United States will continue to build ships, and we won't stop. And in fact, we could probably pave the oceans with our ships, and if we wanted to invade your nation, we could probably have our men walk across the decks of these ships and just with dry feet show up in your home territory. So in essence, what they were saying was, either you can try to keep up with us, or you can join us and we can all cut together, which would be in everyone's best interest, not only to stop war, but of course to stop expenditures. Now, was this a bluff by the United States? Well, that's a pretty interesting question, because I would argue that it was, and in fact, obviously the delegates from these other nations who ultimately agreed to this had never taken this class, because they would know that the United States was definitely going to disarm after a big war, as we always had, but the threat of the U.S. continuing to build and outbuilding everyone else was enough, as well as the benefit, to convince the signatories on the Washington Naval Conference to not only agree, but actually follow through on stopping production, disarming themselves in a sense, and keeping their ships at this ratio. So for every 5 that the U.S. had, the British got 5, the Japanese 3.5. It was actually based on tonnage, but that's a secondary concern. So this particular attempt at holding the peace was one that actually worked relatively well until World War II actually began. And it did so because it was actually structured to work in the self-interest of the nation themselves. And this is a type of agreement or peace policy that has a chance of actually succeeding in the real world. Now let's compare that to a peace treaty that got a lot more publicity and was seen as and hailed as something that would save the world that was signed in 1927 and signed by 15 different nations. It was called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It was negotiated between the U.S. Secretary of State Kellogg, yes, as in the breakfast cereal, and the French Foreign Minister Briand, I guess as in Chateaubriand, were the two people that put it together, but it was signed by 15 nations, and everyone who signed it said they renounced war as an instrument of policy. Both Kellogg and Briand received the Nobel Peace Prize, and it was hailed for keeping the peace, but in truth, it was nothing more than a bunch of nations signing it and saying they wouldn't go to war, but of course in reality they would. One of the nations that signed it, in fact, was Germany. So that leads us to talking about the election that brings in this time of the Roaring Twenties, and that is the election of 1920. Now Harding, as we talked about, ran on a mandate or a policy of stabilize America first, prosper America first, think of America first, and thus it's known as the America First campaign. And the idea was, we've done enough crusading, we've paid enough attention to the rest of the world, let's take care of ourselves. The Democrats again run on the idea of trying to continue to be in the League of Nations and continue to be progressive, but the Republicans win a substantial amount of the vote. As you can see, the electoral vote 76 to 24%, and the actual popular vote 60 for Harding and only 34 for James Cox, the Democratic candidate. So Harding wins, and we're going to see that the three Republicans who get elected in the 1920s usually win by a handy margin, or a substantial margin. One little note, and you see the asterisk there, a young Franklin Roosevelt, prior to contracting polio and becoming paralyzed, was the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, and so we see him on the national stage at this point, but obviously being the vice presidential candidate didn't make enough of a difference then to get the American people to vote for the Democrats. So in the 20s, the Republicans are ascendant, and so when the good times are good, the Republicans are very much hailed during the 1920s, but as we'll see, eventually they'll be blamed for the Depression, and they actually continue today to be sort of accused of economic policies that could bring all kinds of trouble to the American people as a result of it. So between 20 and 32, the Republicans dominate the presidency and Congress. They solidify the Republican pro-business image, and the Democrats get the leftovers, eventually seen as supporting the common man. Harding, as one of his colleagues said, he was a first-rate, second-rate man. And what they meant by that was he was a very good guy, at least they thought, but he wasn't really a great administrator, and really is not seen as today as being too great of a president. Probably the most well-known phrase that goes along with his presidency is the one you see there, "My damn friends are the ones that keep me up at night." Ultimately, the way we see Harding today was that there were lots of scandals within his administration. The country's eyes turn away from government. Everything is running okay. Everybody seems to be making a lot of money, is what we're talking about. But what happens is that the people in his administration will actually be taking quite a bit of payoff money from businesses and elsewhere. Harding himself will never actually be connected to these, but his administration, as I showed there, has become almost as corrupt as Grant's had been, and we'll talk more about that later. But the truth is that while he's president, he's very, very popular. So let's talk a little bit about what actually happens during the 1920s. And one of the things is the way the Republicans approached the economy of the United States. As we'll see, money is rolling in. In fact, employment goes up every year, and the American people really seem to be doing well. As a consequence, the government actually collects more actual cash with lower tax rates. This is all prompted by the decisions of the Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon. Mellon, as you're probably familiar with, was then, and his legacy lives on within the banking community. And so what the Republicans tended to do during the 20s was appoint people to government who had worked in a particular industry, which led them oftentimes to be more supportive of the industry than using the government to regulate that industry. But since the economy was good, they could get away with it. In fact, this may sound interesting to you, but and almost hard to believe, But things are so good economically during this time that Mellon brings out what has been called the soak the poor idea for taxes. These are the changes that he got implemented, convincing Congress to pass them, and of course the Republican presidents he serves under will sign them. He removed excess profit taxes, as he called it, on big corporations and on individuals who he said were being taxed too much. So basically he decreased the amount of tax that was paid by the wealthy during the time that he was Secretary of the Treasury, which was most of the 20s. He actually refunded huge sums of money in taxation that he believed the wealthy had overpaid because they had been overcharged under the Democrats. And he literally wrote the checks out himself to those who he believed had been overtaxed. And one of the things that he did was get legislation passed called the Revenue Act of 1924 that cut taxes and actually gave a lot of people who had paid taxes in the past a refund. And we'll see later that some people believed all this money was pumped into the stock market and thus amplified the problems that we'll see in 1929 with the stock market crash. Now, the idea here is that the taxes in government should be paid by the lower classes and that the upper class should keep their money, because when the upper class keeps its money, then it invests in business, and that provides jobs for everyone, makes the economy grow, and so the money is held by the top and the benefits then trickle down to the rest of the country. This was not called trickle-down economics back then, but the same basic premise of cutting taxes on the wealthy, letting the lower classes pay more, is the idea during Reagan's administration in the 1920s. Those who don't like this particular type of taxation often call it trickle-on economics, bringing up a different image. But the idea is that if the wealthies keep their money, then they invest it, and thus everyone benefits, instead of giving it to the poor, who would then, if they weren't taxed and kept their money, they would spend it on goods that really don't help the overall economy. So here's the scandal we were talking about before. This is probably the best known scandal during the Harding administration. It's called the Teapot Dome scandal. I remember studying this when I was in high school, and when I first saw it I thought, what would a teapot have to do with a scandal? But in truth, this deals with federal land that had been put aside for environmental, or actually conservation purposes, that private oil companies wanted to drill on. It was out in Wyoming, and it was in a geological formation known as a geological dome, and the dome itself was called the Teapot Dome. That was the name of it. So this is the idea of a large geological area that was given the name Teapot. And Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, actually gave the rights to a private oil company to drill there for literally a suitcase full of cash, and he is caught with it. Another Harding appointee also is caught doing something else and commits suicide to avoid prosecution. Harding's not connected to the scandal until afterwards, and what I mean by afterwards is after a very unfortunate event takes place. So Harding gets wind of this, hears that it's going to be published in the newspapers and that it's going to make him look very bad. So to avoid all of this, he actually takes off and goes about as far away as you can get and still stay in the United States. He went to Alaska, of all places, which was then a territory of the United States. And on his trip back, he's actually taking a train from San Francisco back to D.C. He dies of a stroke, and at the time that he died, the economy was doing so well that people truly mourned him as president, and it wasn't until after his death that the scandals came out. But luckily for the Republicans, who you might think would lose elections as a result of being shown to be so much involved in scandal, the man who took over for Harding was the perfect person to clean up the mess. And this is a man by the name of Calvin Coolidge from Massachusetts, who was well known as being very pious, very honest, and in fact had made his political name cleaning up corruption in his home state. And so when he takes office, he quickly goes after people who were involved in things, gets them taken out of government, and sort of moves along quickly, which causes the American people to quit paying attention and not blame the Republicans. Coolidge himself, as a president, was actually not very